Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the second episode of the sixth season of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America and around the world. The last episode was our first ever Religion and Live, and it exceeded our expectations with participants joining us live on the campus of Indiana University, as well as our usual webinar format participants. Thank you, Doctors Andrew Whitehead, João Chavez, Juanilso Pachaco, and Miranda Cruz for a thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation on religion and cross-cultural Christian nationalism. If you didn't get a chance to catch it, please check it out on our YouTube channel, or if you just want to listen to this or any episode, we are now available everywhere you download your favorite podcasts. This year, our theme is World on Fire, and today we continue with that theme with another transnational and powerhouse panel of theorists that will explore religion in the midst of our rapidly changing world, religion and new religious movements, and contemporary crisis. This episode of Religion and is going to delve into how contemporary religious movements address urgent political, cultural, and environmental crises, from technological transformation to ecological collapse, and from ideas and topics that expand and push and help us think about the far reach and the real importance of new religious movements as we theorize and think about this current moment. Please remember that throughout today's session, we are asking you all to submit questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. This will enable our hosts and panelists to engage these questions as they facilitate this important conversation. Now I want to introduce my colleague and today's host, Dr. Kelly Hayes. Dr. Kelly E. Hayes is a professor of religious studies at Indiana University Indianapolis. She is an ethnographer who conducts long-term fieldwork projects. She is also an expert on alternative and new religious movements, Brazilian religions, religion and healing, and religions of the African diaspora, and religion, gender, and sexuality. She studies forms of human cultural production that outsiders label as cults or black magic. That is a way of engaging the supernatural that are deemed illegitimate and the communities that are formed around them. She has done amazing work and has just come out with a recent book, and I'm so excited to introduce to you all and to have Dr. Kelly Hayes introduce the remainder of this panel to us for today's exciting conversation. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. And thank you so much to all of the panelists. It's my great pleasure to host this conversation. I want to introduce in reverse alphabetical order, starting with Benjamin Zeller. Ben is the Irving L. and Fern W. Young Presidential Professor of Religion and Chair of Religion at Lake Forest College, which is right outside Chicago in the United States. He is a specialist in North American religions, focusing on religious currents that are new or alternative. And he is also one of the editors of the preeminent journal for the study of new religious movements, Nova Religio. Welcome, Ben. Next, we have Daria Hartmann, who is at the Institute of Religion at the University of Münster in Germany, and she is writing her dissertation right now on QAnon. Thank you so much for joining us, Daria. Lastly, we have Knut Graf, or Graf, as they say in German. I always get thrown off by the spelling. Knut is a social and cultural anthropologist. He is currently at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities, working on a project on alternative rationalities and esoteric practices in global perspective at the University of Erlangen in Erlangen, Germany. And indeed, that is where we first met, as I also have been participating in that center. So welcome, panelists. I'm really thrilled that we have panelists from many different time zones joining us today. And I want to start off with each of you, if each would address what defines a new religious movement for you in your work. And do new religious movements differ from established religions in their approach to modern crises? So Ben, if we can start with you.
Sure. Yeah. You're going to ask the guy who edits the journal on new religions to try to define them, right? So, well, much like the constituent terms religion, it's impossible to come to a single definition. And different historians and sociologists have made different attempts. Eileen Barker, who's probably one of the most preeminent scholars of new religious movements, uses basically a chronological definition. Either it's a new religion is a religion which was born in the last one or two or maybe even three generations, or she simply says there's sort of a post-war one. So that now she wrote this in the 90s. So post-war was 30 years ago, post World War II. But basically, she uses a chronological approach, and I think that's pretty helpful because for me, what makes them interesting is they can respond in rapidly. They typically have either a living founder. Or some sort of apparatus to respond quickly, either through revelation or textual study or direct spiritual access, in a way in which more sort of longer established religions do not. So they're quick changing, which is fascinating to study. But they can also respond to what's going on around them. To respond to, for example, the ecological crisis or changes in technology or science or globalization in ways that certainly every religion can, but it's different when you can get sort of directly from the source. So that's one way they're different. And then there's all sorts of social distinctions as well, because they tend to be smaller. They tend to often be communal. They tend to often be more intensive. I don't like the word totalistic because it implies, it's sort of dangerous behavior. But totalistic in the sense of they tend to give sort of full answers to the questions about how you live your life and how you structure it. Of course, all religions do that.
Thank you. Daria, how do you think about new religions, and is QAnon, can we consider it a new religion?
Well, I just read a book that was titled From Conspiracy Theory to New Religious Movement by Marc-André Argentino, who's done a lot on QAnon. But so I think there are some people who would argue that it's a new religious movement, or it could be seen as such. But I'm sometimes find this term a bit difficult to work with, especially because, like, I do understand it more from, similar to what Benjamin just said, when you look at newer movements, and then it's more of a temporal distinction in a sense, and that might have some influence on how institutionalized it is. And then, of course, how flexible it is, or these movements are in responding to these crises. But sometimes I wonder if it kind of can be a bit normative, or to use this term. And I mean, from what I understood, it was often kind of became more popular after the cult term, was something that became very difficult to use within religious studies because of the, connotations the term has. So I think sometimes it feels like these connotations have been, just kind of transferred to this new term. And then I wonder if it's really such a big difference between, religions and new religious movements and how they respond to crisis, or if it's more of a way we actually, categorize these terms that also make us think they respond differently to it. But, that's just my perspective on it.
Newt, what about you? How do you understand new religious movements, and do you think that they are doing anything differently from more established traditional religions?
Well, I guess the term new religious movements is really a relational one. That's a comparative one, right? We compare it with other movements, with something that has been there before. For me personally, contemporary has always been a little bit more central than new, because I always see a lot of continuities, similarities, especially as I'm primarily a scholar of practices. So I studied divination practices in West Africa, especially in Senegal, which is a largely Islamic context somehow. So there's often emphasis on tradition. And at the same time, it's very innovative. It's very new. It's incorporating different local traditions, pre-Islamic traditions. And also the time frame, what is so striking, I think, in the African context is that many new religious groups or communities originated in relation to the colonial period. or during the colonial period. So that sometimes makes it like it's 100 years ago. So it may be 3-4 generations. So yeah, there are different definitions, but my own fieldwork, for instance, I lived for 2 years in a particular village in southern Senegal among Mandinka speakers, and that village was a religious foundation that had been founded by a religious leader, and that was 2 generations ago. So in that regard, it would have, but they inscribe themselves into the Islamic tradition at the same time. So it's new and traditional at the same time, if you want.
Well, I often think in my own work, I mean, there are many definitions of new religions movements, just as there are religions, but one that I've found useful for thinking about my own work in Brazil puts some of the emphasis on that new religious movements emerge in the modern period. So they reflect the epistemological structures of the modern world, post-Enlightenment. So we have, you know, the hegemony really of a scientific worldview, right, that you have to contend with, but also the decentering of the human being. So the human is no longer the center of the universe, literally. And so I find thinking about new religious movements kind of as they are responding to this huge epistemic shift, both kind of in terms of epistemology, but also ontology, that the modern period brings, also different kinds of economic arrangements as well. And I'm curious to know for each of you how crises, whether those are environmental or social, political, economic, how from your own field of specialty, how crises play into the formations of the groups or the practices that you study. And maybe Ben, we'll start with you.
Sure, great. Well, so a lot of my research is on UFO religions and other groups that very explicitly are responding to science and technology. What I find fascinating is you can actually track the whatever's going on in the world in terms of what the UFO religious content is about. So the first wave of UFO religions mid-century were very much mid-20th century. In the wake of the first flying saucer sightings, we're very much responding to the advent of nuclear war, nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, and the danger this posed. So you have space aliens supposedly coming to speak to prophets here on Earth and saying, now that humans have the bomb, we think you need to elevate, you've elevated yourselves technologically, scientifically, you have to elevate yourself spiritually as well. Otherwise you risk destroying us and destroying your planet and destroying everything. And then later on, so for example, one of the concerns that the Raelians have, which is a movement from much later, late 20th century, much more concerned about environmental and ecological developments. But also sort of a dawning fascination and appeal of human cloning and other sort of biotech and biohacking, what we might call transhumanism. And in fact, so some of the contemporary UFO religions I'm studying right now embrace ideas about AI and actually talk about space aliens as being forms of AI or having AI or being like AI. And other sort of transhumanist claims. So this is very contemporary. So it's to be clear, if you're a member, if you're a believer, that is simply what the aliens are saying. So I mean, much like any religion, so I'm bracketing here. But from my perspective, it's really fascinating that you can actually track what are the big concerns in society. And I think you're absolutely right, Kelly. It comes down to this epistemological, ontological transformation of modernity and sort of post-modernity. But the advent of science and technology, globalization, our new economic system, everything about it calls for religious response. And I definitely see it. Again, UFO religions are, because they put science and technology at the center, I think maybe they do it more explicitly, but we see it implicitly elsewhere.
Daria, what about you? Technology seems absolutely crucial to QAnon.
Oh, you can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, part of I think what's important to understand with QAnon is that it's something that is quite digital in, its entire being, in a sense. It's something that emerged within the digital space. So a lot of the practices that I look at are fundamentally shaped by, for example, the platforms they are on. And that's what I find very interesting because, it's kind of, it is like very religious in the way I look at these meaning practices, in the way that I understand them, but they're very, shaped by how these platforms, kind of what practices they allow. And I think that's also quite important in general when, looking at religious movements now, that, when you look at platforms like TikTok or YouTube and stuff, there's a lot of changes occurring now in the way people are actually using them for religious practices. And I think that's one of the fundamental way like technology is kind of intertwined with QAnon. And in terms of your previous question, kind of what crises it responds to, I mean, you probably know that better than I do. It was something that emerged during during Trump's first presidency, in a sense that there was a prior conspiracy theory, Pizzagate, which then evolved into QAnon. And I think a lot of it is kind of this very populist energy, that kind of criticizes a lot of political corruption and it's kind of evolves around institutional distrust, which is also very much connected to this epistemological shift and how we might construct knowledge in modernity, and that's why for me it's very interesting to look at QAnon because it kind of touches a lot of these very important changes we see now. Yeah.
I actually want to ask you another question before I turn to Knut on the topic of QAnon. If you could just talk a little bit about how we might think about QAnon as a new religious movement, and if you think that that's a useful approach.
I think it's a valid way of looking at it. I mean, I've read paper that kind of proposed this idea that over time it kind of became more like a religion as it evolved. Like Argentino is one of the scholars who proposes this idea, and he actually also looked during the pandemic. It was quite interesting because there was like you could see there's a lot of very religious motifs and idea within QAnon, but then there were actually people within certain churches who used like there's something called Q drops, which is part of a of text within QAnon, and they use the Bible to like interpret these Q drops, and they became part of kind of the Christian practice, which it's quite interesting in the way it was adapted. So I think there's a way of looking at this and thinking, okay, it kind of resembles a religion more and more. But actually, from my perspective, and I think that's why I'm so interested in like truth construction and meaning making in a more broader term. It's interesting to look at conspiracy theories, if you call them that, and religion in a way they might resemble each other, functionally, or if they have similar, if they fulfill similar needs, for example. And I think that's what interests me specifically, because I think quite often, I would say what they provide are specific frames of viewing the world in a sense, and these frames are then very powerful because they also like influence how people act and the practices that evolve from them. So I think in that sense, it's for me more interesting to look at it than just being like, does it resemble a religion, or could I qualify it as such? Because I think from looking at this perspective, it kind of provides similar functions for the people who actually take part in it.
Okay, so functions of providing a master narrative, providing a set of practices that are then created around that master narrative, or an interpretive strategy for understanding your life, your position in the world, and then institutions that develop right around those.
Yeah, but I think, yeah, in terms of institutions, it's interesting because it's still quite loose in a sense, like what I do is I actually look at influencers, because within QAnon, there was a time when I felt it kind of shifted towards different people who have their own spaces online, and they have their own little communities, and they interpret, what QAnon involves differently. And some of them, kind of interpret it more religiously, and some others, have different frames. And that's why I'm thinking, it's interesting that it doesn't really necessarily translate into then real life institutionalized forms, at least not yet. It's mostly online, and it's mostly like in these smaller little spaces. And I mean, there's some instances where, people, for example, acted based on QAnon beliefs, or tried to storm the Comet pizza store and that sort of thing. But I would say it's interesting that it hasn't happened so much, and it's mostly still a practice that happens in the digital space, at least, when you look at it empirically.
Thank you. Knut, I want to turn to you with the question of what is how in your field of expertise, how crises are dealt with, and what are some examples of crises?
Well, in a way, divination is really always a means to deal with a crisis. That crisis usually is a personal one. In terms of like the forms being used in the environment where I worked, that looked more traditional. It wasn't digital. One would be using shells and very traditional means to do divination. But the concerns were always contemporary, were always actual, like concerning problems in the contemporary life world. One of the most frequent reasons why people would go to a diviner in Senegal, for instance, was migration. It had very often to do with either the wish to migrate, whether that would be possible or not, or with a relative who was actually abroad, and people would be inquiring about the situation of that person. So migration somehow, one way or the other, featured in almost all the consultations that I witnessed and documented. What to me is interesting there about the term crisis is also how we understand that. Like, I think when we normally speak about it, we think about some kind of difficult situation or something like that, kind of predicament. But when you look at the actual, like the literary meaning of the term, then it has to do, I mean, it's a term that is more than 2,000 years old, comes from ancient Greek, and means something like evaluating or judging or taking a decision. So it's a period, it's a kind of a situation that forces us to take a certain situation. I think what new religious movements or contemporary religious practices do is they somehow are expressive of a decision being taken in relation to a particular situation. And this is something that the diviners I worked with, they knew that. They were very conscious about that when a client comes to them, that person came for a particular reason, and that coming to a diviner, going for a consultation, was already a sign of the fact that the person had taken a decision to do action, to do something, to kind of move out of that situation, to look for help or ritual help to go about that situation. And I would say that this, what characterizes divination so much, that it is so concrete and connected to the existential situation of a person. I think that religious movements also have that. Their narratives may be more complicated. They may be more cosmological. All of that may be less visible, but they do respond to the situation. And people apparently find something in those movements and in those newly emerging movements that speaks to them. And that has to do with their contemporary lives. So yeah, it's about, it's not just about difficult situations, how we deal with them, how we respond to them, what kind of decision we want to take.
Thank you. I'm curious what is if there is a role or if there are appeals to hidden knowledge or hidden truths, and what role that might play either in kind of what we think of new religious movements or even something like QAnon. Can we start with you, Ben?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose you could break down new religious movements into either the esotericist or non-esotericist categories. So ones that are esotericist explicitly put revelation of hidden knowledge either for everyone or for a select few at the center. I suppose a standard sort of example of that people typically use would be Scientology, where you have to advance through certain levels and then theoretically open to anyone with the right sort of resources. A person could move through the levels and gain access to the secret knowledge. But I think even outside of esotericist groups, most new religions claim special knowledge that is useful to all of us. And sometimes they claim that's right there in our texts. So, for example, a Christian apocalyptic group might say that it's been printed there for 2,000 years, and you just need to know the right interpretive key, and then you will figure out. So, I mean, Heaven's Gate's an example of that UFO group I studied. They say it's been in the text the whole time. We just didn't know that when it says Christ went up to heaven in a cloud, it actually meant a UFO. So the text just has to be interpreted. So it's not necessarily secret knowledge. It's just knowledge we didn't have access to because we'd never seen a flying saucer yet. And I can think of analogous claims in Asian groups as well. They say, well, the Bhagavad Gita has always said this, and we just now we're explaining to you what it means, or this is a form of meditation which we've always had in India or in Japan or in China, but now we're sharing with all of you. But I think on a psychological level, and I should be clear, I'm not a psychologist of religion, but as an armchair one, I think there's a certain appeal, and I'm curious what Daria thinks about this too, because I think conspiracism is linked. There's a certain appeal to having access to special knowledge and to be the first one or the first part of a group to have access to special knowledge, which will empower you and change the world. And I can see why that would be an appealing thing. And I think that's often the draw. And when people say, why would a person join a group like this? They must be brainwashed. They must be crazy. Well, maybe they're getting something out of it. And then I wonder to what extent part of what they're getting out of is a feeling of knowledge is power, and they're feeling empowered, and they feel special if it's special knowledge. And I think that's part of the appeal of such groups. But again, I'm curious for those who studied conspiracism or esotericism, if it's the same sort of answer.
Thank you, Daria.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's exactly that. I also think the first thing you said connects to what I would see within QAnon. And insofar, it's mostly about the interpretation of it. It's kind of, I think it's interesting because like all the information, within QAnon, it's online, everybody can see it, but there are differences in how good people are at decoding it or interpreting it. So that's, I think, the important part, that you do have to gain a special skill to then gain access to that secret knowledge. And when you do, it changes your life in a sense. And I think one part is that it of course changes the way you see the world. The world then makes more sense within this framework, what you're discovering. And also, and I mean, I'm also not a psychologist, but I do think, you become part of this enlightened minority, and The emic language, you would say you're not, part of the sheeple anymore. Yeah, that's the word they use. It's kind of the sleeping masses that are just following what everybody says. No, you're the one who is awakened and can see the world for what it really is. And that's why, I think kind of trying to decode this hidden truth is kind of a central aspect of QAnon. And I think that's why all of these practices evolve around it so much. And I do think that also connects to esotericism as well, at least in this hermeneutic understanding of decoding and decrypting, these secretive texts and messages.
Knut, it seems to me that interpretation is key to divination. Can you tell us a little bit about how that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, maybe divination is maybe the most paradigmatic hermeneutic practice, historically speaking. I mean, one has always tried to read signs in relation to one's own life, in relation to a current situation of some kind. And of course, there is something about this aspect of secrecy that is very important all the time. It's like the oracle is kind of the embodiment of the unknown knowledge. Like it's in the oracle where you find the knowledge. It's not the person carrying it, but it's somehow coming from somewhere else. It's to an extent that in the context where I worked, where you would use, for instance, cowrie shells to read about the situation of a person. The diviners were not supposed to be the authors of those divinatory statements, but they would always say, it says, and they were referring to the cowrie shells. So it's really the oracle is kind of the prophetic divinatory device out of which knowledge emerges. And yeah, it's almost like a bit of a prototype of a religious moment that we see there in action. It's where knowledge kind of surfaces, presents itself to us anew and new. And that has a great fascination. And if that relates to us, to our situation, consciously or not, in divination, this is very clear. You go with a particular problem. So you want these divinatory statements to relate to you, and they do. And that's how you measure the quality of a consultation, also not so much the end results, like whether that will happen in the future or not. That's another question. But people are convinced about consultations when the diviner is able to see their problem in the shells or in the geomantic signs or whatever method they use. So it's really, I think, again and again, when you look at those concrete practices, it's about how does it relate to something that is important to you. And the difference may only be that in divination, that's usually a conscious problem. It's something that you are aware of yourself, that where you're looking for a solution. And in larger religious movements, that may be a bit more vague. It may be more opaque even to the participants. Like they may not exactly know why that particular narrative or new theological statement has that particular attraction to them. But I'm quite sure that it responds to something that's in the air, something that needs a response. And that's what people then kind of tie into and address.
Thank you. I want to remind the audience that you can drop some questions into the Q&A at any point, and we will get to that a little bit later in our hour together. So please feel free to ask your own question. And as we move on, I'm thinking about how all of these cases, there's so many overlaps in different ways. But I'm curious to get back to the question of crisis, it seems to me that QAnon responds to a very particular kind of confluence of things. And in our earlier conversation, Dara, you had sort of characterized it as the neoliberal, or the post-neoliberal, perhaps, state. And Benjamin, you had said earlier that new religious movements seem to be able to respond very quickly to crises. And Knut, of course, divination seems like something that has always been able to respond to crises of different kinds. But I'm wondering if there are specific crises. This is a question for you, Ben, that new religious movements, you tend to see them responding to, political, economic, because, or things that are more fast moving, perhaps. So that's a question for you. And then for Daria, if you could talk a little bit about QAnon as a response to the kind of post-neoliberal or neoliberal state. And then Knut, if you could talk a little bit about divination, if it is effective for particular kinds of crises, or if there are any particular uses that it is often called upon. So Ben, we'll start with you.
Sure. So one of the old theories of who joins new religious movements or cults was the deprivation model. It was people who were sort of lost, or they were missing something, they were deprived, and then it became relative deprivation. They just sort of sensed it, and that's not a theory we use anymore. But the idea at the core of it is the people who join groups are people who are socially liminal. A person who's well established in their life, in their family, in their house of worship, whatever it is unlikely to join a group. People who are socially liminal or looking or dislocated tend to be looking for answers to questions. So the sort of challenges or crises which most affect those sort of people are the ones that I think they respond to. Kelly, I would actually go to your work on the Valley of the Dawn as a really good example, right? So it's people who are living in a transformation in the physical space they're living in the government and the governance of the nation state they're living in globalization, which affects all of us. And they're the ones that are drawn to, I don't want to paraphrase your work for you, but I mean, everyone should read Kelly's book. But it's the way in which members of that community found value in that, in the religion that was offered to them. I think that, and that sounds more passive than I meant, because it's not just offered to them, they make meaning out of it. They encounter religious ideas and people make meaning out of it, they make community. So yes, I mean, so in the United States case, in the US case, it's typically people who are sort of young adults who are likely to join. So the sort of problems that affect young adults, those are the ones. So it could be the political climate, the economic climate. So in the 1960s and 70s, it was the counterculture. In the 90s, it was sort of responding to Reaganomics, and we have responses which either sort of embrace it, sort of using new age techniques so you can become rich, wealthy, beautiful, and happy, or reject it, go live in a commune somewhere, right? So these are general broad social trends, but I would say things that affect young people and people who are religious seekers or open to new religious ideas because of where they are in their life. That's where we're going to see sort of those crises and the ones that have legs people respond to. Again, read Kelly's book. It's great.
I didn't ask him to say that. Sorry.
Yeah, well, to respond to that, I do think it's probably a combination of a lot of things. I think what's important about looking at conspiracist movements like QAnon is that often conspiracy theories also, kind of provide something for the people who believe in them. And I think especially in situations where there's kind of there's ambiguity, there's anxiety, there's this feeling of loss of control, you're not capable of, just living anymore. And I think in my, opinion, like the last few decades have been really destabilizing in a lot of ways, in the sense that for a lot of people, there's, certain safety guards have been removed. There's a lot of economic disparity, there's a lot of political polarization, there's a loss of trust in institutions, and also knowledge institutions like academia, and like a lot of trust in politics. So I think when you're in that situation, and you're not doing well yourself, and you're just hurting, it can be helpful to look at conspiracy theories as something that brings some sense of order and meaning to that situation. And I think often, I mean, that's the important part about conspiracy theories. It's attributed, there's a blame that is attributed to somebody, you know, so it's not just the world is evil, but it's actually, it's the fault of a certain group of people, for example. And I think that can feel, you know, helpful for some people, especially if kind of the opposite to that would be to not, you know anymore and to kind of sink into that chaos. So I think that's kind of a similar situation to how, you know, the era or the environment QAnon emerged from. And we saw that with the pandemic, where it became very like a very visible phenomena. And it also kind of, there were some you know, strands of QAnon that actually kind of traveled to other countries. There were some you know, connections in Germany and Europe as well. And I think often it's not really that it's this particular narrative, but it's mostly this feeling that people are kind of fed up, and you know, they it's quite of also very populist you know, energy, in a sense that, you know, there is this criticism of elites, and people kind of have a different, they have something which is often a very basic narrative, and then they can kind of project their own particular you know, grievances onto that. And one more aspect is, I think, digitalization and globalization as also something that kind of is, and I don't think it's just for people who believe in conspiracy theories, but it's overwhelming for a lot of people. And that's why I think often these movements just provide different, you know, ways of dealing with this feeling of being overwhelmed.
Before I move to you, Knut, for this question about sort of particular kinds of crises, I was just struck, and I wanted to ask Daria if it's your sense that the same kind of folks that Ben was describing, so people from marginalized communities or younger folks, as being drawn to new religious movements, are those the same folks that are also drawn to conspiracy theory movements, or do we see any differences?
I'm not completely sure, because I think there are some intersections, and we also saw it, I think, with the pandemic, where certain narratives also kind of traveled within like more of a new age yoga spaces, and you know, where you wouldn't really expect these narratives. And I'm sometimes wondering if it's what is kind of the connecting factor, if it you know, what would, you know, lead you to maybe gravitating towards new religious movements, or what would lead you to gravitating towards conspiracy theories. And maybe it's also not one of the or the other, because I mean, conspiracy theories also travel within new religious movements, and you know, it's kind of, it's not this way or the other. It's kind of probably more of what is the connecting glue. And I do think it's often it often comes down to this distrust of, you know, maybe the established order or authorities, or, you know, specific also epistemic institutions, for example, where you would say, okay, that's why maybe people gravitate towards certain narratives. But maybe then you have a different answer to me.
If I can interject, as you're speaking, I couldn't help, and I was writing down and sort of circling it I was just teaching the book of Job right before this, and the Odyssey. It's the problem of suffering and evil and the problems around us. And one thing that both typically religions broadly, new religions, conspiracy theories answers or attempt to answer is those questions. How come the world is the way it is, and how come it's so crummy? And what can we do to fix it? And there's a certain sort of resonance there. And again, I would think, I mean, Knut, I'd love to hear you have to think too, but I mean, isn't that part of what the Oracle is also addressing? Is how to resolve that fundamental problem of theodicy? Why the existence of suffering and evil and bad stuff? Sorry, Kelly, I'm jumping on your work on your job as the
You're not at all. No, Knut, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, just briefly, I think we need time for the Q&A as well. I was thinking about what really was always useful to me to keep in mind, that this religious life or practices express themselves and develop a certain attraction on different levels. Let's say on a micro, on a meso, and a macro level. So there is this micro level, that's the individual with his personal problems, and then you find something in that practice or in the group that you feel drawn to, that responds to that. Well, if that group, that community, or that practice exists, that also feeds into a larger problem. Apparently, there is something, let's say, taking the example of migration that I mentioned, which is so prominent in the divination rituals that I studied. Individuals have those concerns, but then that may be the entire problem of a generation or of many young people in a certain environment. So it is not by far not just individual. It is a larger problem. But when a community or a religious practice is able to address those problems, it becomes even more meaningful. Like then it becomes a kind of solution for larger parts of society. And in the migration case, for instance, when divination allows you to negotiate that and to deal with those questions and problems, what is really at stake there is the question of entitlement. Are you entitled to be part of the world? Are you entitled to access the world as anyone else? Or are you being excluded? And I think that plays a huge role in many of those movements. They just address it or express it on different levels. That may be more individual, it may be very abstract, theological, or even cosmological. But it's always somehow giving an answer whether you are part of it and whether you're entitled. And that's the meaningfulness. And when you experience it, then it becomes satisfying to people and they continue. And if it's not, then they drop out again.
Thank you. We're going to move to some of the questions from the audience. So I will read one of these. If an external crisis is no longer pressing and of wide public interest, how do groups respond? Examples might be epidemics or political crises, such as the Epstein controversy in the United States. Thoughts about that question? And I'll just, I believe that our panelists can also see the Q&A, the questions in the Q&A tab, if you click on that at the bottom of your screen. So I'll read it again. If an external crisis is no longer pressing and of wide public interest, how do groups respond, or do groups respond? Examples might be epidemics or political crises, such as the Epstein controversy. Daria.
Well, at least the Epstein example relates directly to QAnon. I mean, I wouldn't be able to maybe answer this question generally, but I think, for example, with the Epstein controversy, it was very interesting to watch it unfold, how it had like in the last few months, because, you could see that at least for QAnon, it is a very important part of the narrative, like Epstein has been a very important figure that kind of is more of a figurehead to illustrate this idea of the satanic pedophile cabal and kind of these different accusations of child trafficking. So, when this became more apparent, that, you know, there might be something that is not being said, you know, and that, you know, there might be different framing of that situation. There was a lot of, I would say also maybe surprisingly critical discussions, because I mean, QAnon is something that is quite, you know, it, like Trump is seen as a very positive figure within the movement. You know, he's kind of this messiah-like figure. But in this situation, a lot of people felt very, I think, probably even disappointed, or like it didn't really fit in their framing of the situation, because, you know, there's this belief that Trump has been working against the deep state for the last few years. So I think there was there was like this feeling, okay, we need to address this issue and we have to keep it important, and, you know, have to have or continue to have conversations about it, because so much of the narratives within QAnon evolve around this idea. So I think that's probably often, you know, it plays an important part in how connected is it to maybe also the movement's identity, in a sense, and how it sees itself as well.
Ben, what about you?
I think this is one of the things that makes new religions so interesting, is they're fast moving and they can change. So in the classic study of this, which has problems, but is the Fessinger study, When Prophecy Fails. So there's a group that if based on Fessinger's study, and there's all sorts of problems with it, but to paraphrase quickly, a prophetic group, they say something's going to happen. It's a end of the world, basically, UFO landing, doesn't happen. The group doesn't fall apart. They keep going, and they keep going for reasons that maybe the book wasn't entirely accurate about. But what mattered is they kept going. The prophecy failed and they didn't end. And that's, to me, one of the takeaways. So yeah, certainly I noticed during the pandemic, there were a lot of new religions that made claims about sort of that COVID-19 was the judgment of God, or was, you know, this or that. Just as during the Cold War, there were folks who read the book of Revelation and said that, you know, this verse refers to the Soviet Union and that verse refers to this and that. And then 10 years later, it means something else. If you have a living prophet, or if you have sort of living direct access to the spirits or the spiritual world, then that can change very rapidly. And that, to me, is part of what makes these groups so interesting, is that the members and the adherents often are willing to see those changes and say, well, we must have been wrong before, or they simply go on to the new right decision. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're brainwashed, deluded followers who will believe anything. Rather, it means that their bonds to the group or the teacher or the theology or the spiritual beings are so high that it doesn't matter if they were wrong before. They have to change an interpretation. I'd be curious, you know, when an oracle is wrong, or when a QAnon prediction doesn't come true, my guess is people don't leave QAnon, or they leave their oracular tradition they're part of, but rather they find ways to make that make sense. And again, now we're back to Fessinger's cognitive dissonance, if you want to use the technical term, right? People get ways around it. So I think that they just move on to the next thing is the honest answer.
Newt, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Well, I think what is striking in divination is that it really moves along with whatever happens in society. So it's very simultaneous in a way. So there's very little dissonance. Some of the signs, the particular symbols, maybe seem anachronistic, but then they will be interpreted in the way that is necessary to make it relevant to the present. But in general, at the same time, those practices are not so much concerned with the news. Like it's not one specific name or one specific event that it takes up. It's more these larger currents that express themselves that are then being dealt with. So like there may be not a particular politician or anyone coming up in any of those sessions ever, but it may be about power or its abuse or people speaking badly about others, things like that. So it's a kind of a different language with which those concerns are then being expressed.
Just a quick comment from the audience. Ben, can you expand on the comment that during the pandemic there were movements that said that COVID-19 was the blank? Sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
Oh, I wouldn't call this sort of a formal scholarship I was doing, but I was paying attention to various sort of forums and things like that. And there were, particularly among sort of Christian apocalyptic believers, there were folks who were trying to fit COVID-19 into their particular interpretations of the book of Revelation, primarily about the end of the world, about whether this was one of the signs of the apocalypse, the beginning of the apocalypse. And when it became apparent that the world was not ending, or at least not ending the way they thought, that quickly went away. But you can find this on sort of like rapture-oriented online sort of forums and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm
I'm certain
reminded of
someone actually formally tracked this. It was not me. I was sitting at home like everyone else. I was just looking at websites and saying, what are sort of apocalyptic people thinking? Oh, they're thinking this is the end of the world, and here's a reason why. So.
Yeah, I was reminded of the year 2000, right? When there was a lot of apocalyptic thinking about that, and then it didn't happen and we all moved on. So that seems to be the trend, right? That people tend to just reinterpret it and move along based on, other factors for which that are very strongly that bind them to a particular religious community or practice. Daria.
And maybe to add to that, what I found was interesting with QAnon, often, they find reasons for why something doesn't take place, So for example, if Trump fails, it was part of the plan to, uncover the deep state and stuff. So I think often it's, just also how you interpret it in a sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm reminded of Unarius, a new religious movement based in San Diego, where the prediction was that the Space Brothers, the aliens with the advanced knowledge, were going to come, and the community got everything ready. And of course, they didn't come. And the answer was that humanity had not progressed enough to be able to receive them, right? So it wasn't seen as something to end, like prophecy did not fail, even when it failed. There's one last question I really want to get to. And that is, there's a lot of conversation as of late around the inevitable death of DJT, Donald J. Trump, and some thinking this will also bring the death of the MAGA cult. Do you have any thoughts on how these groups, like MAGA or QAnon, will evolve with the passing of their perceived leader? And certainly anyone who studied religious history or new religions, I think, has some thoughts about this. So what happens to a religious movement after the death of the charismatic leader?
Well, I can just focus on the QAnon MAGA part. I don't think it necessarily would lead to an end, especially because like what I said before, I think a lot of the identity of QAnon revolves around the shared practices and less on, having Trump. Because like the same with Q. Q was the anonymous poster who posted the Q drops on different boards. And at some point he disappeared and he just, wouldn't post anymore. And people, like, the movement still continued in a sense. And I think there were actually times when it became more popular again, especially, when Twitter changed to X, and suddenly a lot of people that were previously banned came back to X. So I think it's often more about the community and the practices. And I also think it's not just about QAnon, but probably about, there will be another QAnon probably, the same way there had been a previous conspiracy with Pizzagate. So I don't think it just necessarily means that even if one thing ends, we won't have something that will be very similar to it.